Today's lecture, as you know, is on market failure and government failure. Who's heard of the Whig theory of history? The Whig theory of history. You may have not heard of it, but the idea is that history always progresses. Where we are today is because we've learned all the best things from the past, and we've evolved, we took the best lessons, and then we added new stuff. And where we are now is because we fully absorbed everything that there was to know in the past, and we progressed fully, and going backwards in time is a de-evolution. This is a bad theory of history. I call it the Whig theory of history. It was associated with some people associated with the Whig Party. The Whig is spelled W-H-I-G. Whig theory of history. This is a bad theory of history because people forget things, people get persuaded by all sorts of pseudoscience, and the history of economics, the history of economic thought is also not fully immune from pseudoscience and being misled by false beliefs. And I'm sad to say that the economic science had this dark period, in my view, right after the Second World War. It started a little bit earlier, but the real period was the post-Second World War era until about the 70s. About 1945 to about 1980-ish. That was a real dark period in economic theory, where we came up with a lot of terrible ideas. One of these ideas was this idea of market failure. Who's heard of market failure? What's market failure?
The dynamics of some economics, like the relationship between supply and demand and the theories that drive consumers and producers, doesn't help the consumers and producers in the
So the answer was that the dynamics between supply and demand doesn't help consumers. What standard, under what standard can we say it's helping consumers or not? Yeah. Yeah. So, have you guys heard about or read about perfect competition? The idea of perfect competition? What's perfect competition?
Isn't that when like supply and demand are in equilibrium?
Not quite. What's perfect competition? What is perfect competition? Perfect competition, you got an idea? No? Okay, perfect competition is a situation where buyers and sellers have perfect information. They have perfect information. That means they all know everything that is to know about how to make a product, how to buy a product, how to sell a product. That's not it. There's also the fact that there are infinitely many buyers and sellers of a product. So that means, in effect, that the demand curve is perfectly horizontal, it's perfectly elastic. And there are no barriers to entry. That means any idiot who thinks that they have an idea for selling this product, they can come in at will and then start selling right away. That's perfect competition. Does perfect competition sound like any market that you've ever been exposed to? Any market? No. Market failure in economics has a very special meaning, and the definition of market failure is a market outcome that is, I gotta introduce another word, Pareto efficient. Who knows what Pareto efficient is? Pareto efficient, yes?
There's no better way to reorganize outcomes than someone works on.
Yes. You remember we talked about efficiency a few weeks ago? Efficiency was, if there's a way of organizing society better, doing that thing is more efficient. There was a guy named Wilfredo Pareto, very, very smart guy. He came up with something called, he came up with his own standard of efficiency, called the Pareto efficiency. Pareto efficiency is the idea that you can't make someone better off without making at least one other person worse off. You can't make someone better off without making at least one other person worse off. Yes?
Your point regarding like this dark period after World War II, are these all a part of that? Like, or
No. So Wilfredo Pareto was much earlier.
Okay, so like the market failure and
So-
is this it's not bad?
No. Okay. We'll get to that history soon, but I'm just setting it up right now. So we had this idea of Pareto efficiency, which was that when you can't make anyone better off without making someone worse off. They said, how can we get to this Pareto efficiency? And then people figured out that perfect competition, under perfect competition, the outcomes are Pareto efficient. I'll draw what perfect competition looks like. Very simplified. So you have your price and quantity, perfectly elastic demand curve, and then you've got the demand curve also equals your marginal revenue, and then you've got your marginal cost. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost equals demand equals price. You've got this outcome. When these situations hold, we say that it's Pareto efficiency. When everyone knows everything, and when no one can change a price, there's one price for the whole market, there are infinitely many buyers, infinitely many sellers. If you change the price or if you change the quantity, you'll be making some people worse off at the expense of making other people better off. So people came up and said, we call this perfect competition. Perfect competition. So people came up and said anything that isn't perfect competition must be a failure. We don't have perfect competition. That means the market is failing. So they say market outcome that is not Pareto efficient is a market failure. Or, another way, a simplified way of thinking about it, if the market is set up so that the incentives are for producers not to provide the optimal quantity, then that's a market failure. Yes?
How does that link to Pareto efficiency? I'm just having trouble connecting the two because Pareto efficiency is about how you have to make someone else worse off to make someone else better off. How does that
Yeah.
relate to?
That means if you change the market conditions here, the government just comes in and says, this is too high, this quantity is too high, we should be making the selling quantity down here. People will be better off if there are more quantities being provided. If this quantity was provided, because marginal revenue is going to be greater than marginal cost, producers are going to be earning profits, economic profits. And under perfect competition, economic profit is whittled away down to zero.
So that would mean
That means that the producers are better off, but the consumers are worse off.
wouldn't that be Pareto efficient though? Because you're getting one person benefiting from the other.
No, others are becoming worse off. Pareto efficient is you can't make someone better off without making someone else worse off.
Okay.
If you're in a situation where if anyone changes the distribution of outcomes, someone is going to be better off, but someone else is going to be worse off, then that current situation is Pareto efficient.
Okay.
Any other questions? That was a good question. Any other questions? Okay. So, economists came up with this concept of market failure. And then they said, okay, we now have this great concept of market failure, perfectly theoretically valid in their view. So, let's go out and see which markets in the world are exhibiting market failure. How many markets do you think they saw exhibiting market failure? 1, 2, basically everyone. That's the dark period I was referring to. About 30 or 40 period after the Second World War. It was the big trend for economists to look out in the world and say, here's a market failure, there's a market failure. Look at all these wonderful or terrible market failures. There were some, so I mentioned that there were some instances where there were some requirements for perfect competition. One of them was perfect knowledge, perfect information. So one of the requirements for market failure is something called asymmetric information. Asymmetric information. What is asymmetric information? Someone I haven't called on. Asymmetric information. Anyone in the back? No? Abby?
Isn't it when you have sort of a disproportionate amount of information about one thing rather than another, so you don't have confusion over what's going on at all?
Having a disproportionate amount of information. So asymmetric information is when the buyer side or the seller side has more information than the other side. The classic example of asymmetric information is the market for used cars. When you go to buy a used car, the seller of that used car knows the history, right? They know how fast they've driven it, how often they've taken it to the mechanic, how often they've changed the oil, if they've had any major repairs, if they've been in any accidents. You don't have that information. So you have to rely on trust or other sorts of situations. And that creates asymmetric information. So economists said that the used car market was an example of market failure. We won't have the efficient number of used cars for sale because we don't have perfect information. The other criteria was monopoly. Monopoly is a situation where there is one buyer. That's a real monopoly. One buyer. Very, very, very few instances are a situation where there's one buyer. Or alternatively, if you apply it broad enough, everyone is a monopolist. Right? You go down to Joe's Food Basics. That has certain people there working as staff. They provide a unique experience at Joe's Food Basics that you're not going to get at Frank's Food Basics, that you're not going to get at Steve's Food Basics, etc. Even though they're all Food Basics brand, the individual stores have different people. They provide different experiences, so in some broad sense, each person is a monopolist. People don't like that situation because if everyone's a monopolist, no one's a monopolist. So they've changed the definition of monopoly to being not only a single seller, but a large seller. You can charge a different price from the market. There's a mirror version of monopoly called a monopsony. I'll write this down. Monopsony. That's a situation where there's one buyer. Or one large buyer. Yes?
So monopoly is one large seller,
That's right.
and then, because you said before that it was one large buyer, so I'm just confirming that monopoly
large buyer, monopsony is one large seller. Or, I'm sorry, wait, monopoly is one large seller, monopsony is one large buyer. Yes? So, what economists recently have been pointing to as an example of monopsony in the market is people who buy minimum wage labor. That's what a lot of economists think is an example of a monopsony, because they say, oh, the minimum wage people, they're indistinguishable. So people who buy minimum wage labor, they're just effectively one large firm. The classic example is a company town. The company town was popular in the 19th century, where a large mining rig was set up, and a town basically evolved around this mining rig. And then the mining company was the only buyer of labor, because they also had a company store. The company store would be selling also to the employees. Everyone in that town worked for the mining company, etc. A more recent trend is something talking about path dependency. Who's heard of path dependency? Path dependency. Path dependency is the idea that initially people were so ill-informed that they didn't know among the different options which would be the best one. They arbitrarily choose a random one, and then that random one turned out to be not the best one. And then once they get going with that, it turned out that switching to a better alternative would have been too expensive. The classic example for this is the QWERTY keyboard. Why do we use the QWERTY keyboard? Some people allege the so-called Dvorak keyboard is much more efficient. But the reason we're stuck with the QWERTY keyboard is because switching to the Dvorak would be too costly itself. This leads to another situation they call let's say externalities. Externalities, there are positive externalities and negative externalities. Positive externalities means someone is doing something and they have a business, and there are spillovers from that business that benefit other people. There are benefits spilling over. The classic example for positive externalities is public schooling. They say, oh, if you provide schooling, people become more educated, more literate, and the smarter they are, the more literate they are, the more efficient they can be. Negative externality is basically pollution. The existence of a business or something is imposing costs on other people. Continuing on with market failure, we've got public goods. A public good isn't anything that's just nice or is good for the public. In economics, a public good has a very specific definition. Something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. I think we've talked about public goods before, right? Non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Non-rival, non-excludable. What does it mean if something is non-rivalrous? Yes, sir.
Like an unlimited amount of people can use it at the same time?
Yes. If something is rivalrous, like a pizza is rivalrous. If I have a slice, that's one fewer slice for everyone else to have. Well, something that's non-excludable,
you can't like prevent someone from having access to it.
Yeah, you can't stop other people from having access. So people point out to dams and other public works projects. They say these are public goods. The market can't provide these public goods because they can't take advantage of all the benefits, so they'll undersupply public goods. Yes?
I was just wondering how exactly public goods relate to market failure.
People say the existence of public goods, the market can't provide public goods. The market cannot provide public goods, so they are a market failure. Any other questions before moving on? Yes?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you go over path dependency really quickly again?
Path dependency is the situation where initially buyers are confused about what to choose as a product. It's a durable product or something, so they choose arbitrarily. Turns out over time that the choice that they made was inefficient, but switching to a better choice would be too costly. The transition costs, you can think of it, would be too costly. The QWERTY, switching from a QWERTY keyboard to a Dvorak keyboard, people say is too costly, even though allegedly the Dvorak keyboard is better. Yes? Question is, do we have path dependency when it comes to coal and, I guess, other fossil fuels, right? Our entire system is based on fossil fuels. Some people allege that this is a path dependency, we can switch to renewables, or we should have switched to renewables. I would say that that doesn't fit the proper definition because at the time, coal and other fossil fuels were extremely cheap. So the choice wasn't arbitrary. It was an economic choice. It was extremely cheap. Yes? Guys, quiet down, please.
That you didn't even know existed, because I guess at the time, people who, like, during the Industrial Revolution, when we started using coal, we didn't even know that solar panels were a thing.
So,
Is that why?
so solar panels were new technology, but solar power has always been around, right? Plants use solar power, and people use the sun to dry their clothes, etc. Yes?
Sorry, weren't the QWERTY keyboards designed so that when you're using the actual separated keys wouldn't hit each other when you went to type? So it was, there's built-in efficiencies so that you don't end up jamming?
Yes, so the history of the QWERTY keyboard is that initially some typewriters, there are some keys you use more than others. The QWERTY keyboard spread them out so that they don't jam when you're using them. And then another man by the name of Dvorak came along and designed a new kind of keyboard. He said it's even more efficient than the QWERTY. And people said that it was more efficient, and then they say, oh, why are we switching to Dvorak? It's because people are too used to the QWERTY, even though it's less efficient than the QWERTY.
But it would be an arbitrary choice then, right?
It was alleged to be arbitrary. It was alleged initially to be an arbitrary choice between QWERTY and Dvorak.
Oh, okay.
Between QWERTY and Dvorak. Any other questions? Okay. So the economists came up with all these market failures. The question was, what do we do about these market failures? And the solution was always government intervention. So just going back down our list, when there's asymmetric information, government intervention comes in the lemons market. They have to require certain reporting and certain advertising regulations, etc. When it comes to monopoly and monopsony, the government has to come in and break apart the monopolies and monopsonies. Who's heard of antitrust regulation or legislation? Antitrust, that's the old term for anti-monopoly legislation. A trust is a type of legal partnership, a trusteeship. You've heard of trust fund kids. People were entering into trusts. the government came up and started busting the trust busters. Path dependency, government comes in and just requires you or bans certain goods and says you have to use this other one. Or taxes some things arbitrarily to benefit the others. That's the feed-in tariffs under modern technologies. That's what they're trying to do. Externalities. When it comes to negative externalities, governments are said we need to tax negative externalities. And when it comes to positive externalities, is we have to subsidize them. Tax negative externalities, subsidize positive externalities. Tax negative externalities because we want less of them. Subsidize positive externalities because we want more of them. On public goods, the argument is that the market will never provide public goods. So now the government has to come in and provide public goods instead. Starting in the 60s, but it really started taking off in the 80s after a certain Nobel Prize. There came to be some pushback against this market failure framework. People started talking about something called government failure. Government failure. Just because there's a market failure doesn't mean that the best solution is for the government to come in and try to correct the market. Because there also exists a government failure. Government failure means that when the government comes in to try to make something better, they'll actually make things worse. Government failure is that the government intervention produces a worse market outcome than the existing market outcome. There are several sources of government failure. The first is information problems. Who remembers the Hayek reading from the very, very first week, The Use of Knowledge in Society? Yes. What was your takeaway from the Hayek reading?
More particular person within the economic system can have access to all the information.
Yes. No one person can know all the information. Remember on Monday we split up the 4 kinds of knowledge? Known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. Government agents face the same kind of ignorance as market agents. They don't know what the optimal outcome is. They don't know what the optimum price is, what the optimal quantity is. So that's the first issue, but there's more. Second is enforcement costs. We talked about this as well. Enforcement costs. Say you want people to switch to solar panels, but let's say we live in caveman days. We don't have electricity yet. In order to start with the solar panels, we have to reduce our consumption by a lot. So we're stuck as cavemen for thousands of years longer than we would have otherwise been. More people die due to disease, etc. So that's a cost-benefit analysis. The costs of enforcing a regulation exceed the benefits. Same thing also to the Laffer curve I drew last week, where enforcing a 100% tax rate means you're going to get 0 tax revenue. What if the government wanted to enforce a situation where there were no more traffic fatalities? No more traffic fatalities. What would they have to do?
No one drive.
Either no one can drive, which means we're back on horse and buggies, which means we're back dying of dysentery on our cross-country trips. Remember dying of dysentery? Remember?
Yeah.
Or you'd have to drive at 1 kilometer an hour on the roads. Or an economist came up with this proposal. If you really want people to drive safe, instead of making people wear seatbelts, because if you're wearing a seatbelt, are you driving safer? Think of it this way. If you're wearing a seatbelt, are you driving safer? Yes?
I mean, if you were to
Why?
get in a crash and you became a projectile, it would be safer for everyone.
Yes. Here.
Yeah, you're more worried you're less worried about crashing.
Yeah, you're less worried about crashing. There was a famous economic study after they made wearing seatbelts mandatory. It found that the deaths of drivers went down. So does that mean it was safer? Does that mean it was safer? No. Because what happened instead? The deaths of pedestrians went up. So the economist came in and said, if you really want people to drive safe, make it mandatory that every steering wheel has a big spike pointing right towards the driver. That'll make sure people drive safe, right? Or at least very slowly. So enforcement costs, they could be too high.
Wait for the answer.
Regulatory capture. Regulatory capture. Who knows what regulatory capture is? Regulatory capture. So you set up a regulation, you determine you have the information, you are not worried about the enforcement costs, so you set up the regulatory agency, you staff it with regulators. Regulatory capture is a phenomenon where the regulators end up working for the people they're supposed to be regulating. You're a government, you only have a limited budget, so you pay your regulators maybe $100,000 a year, and then you also give them a very generous retirement package. They retire at 55 with a full pension. 55-year-olds, they're still agile, their minds still typically work, they're still typically energetic. They can't just sit around at home twiddling their thumbs all day. So they say, I need some work. Even though I'm getting a full pension, I need some work. What are they likely to do? Well, what's an entrepreneur likely to do? Yes?
They know that there's lacking more information on the government side than the regulators side. So they're going to offer their information they have from what they were a regulator.
The people being regulated will hire the regulators to work for them. They'll give them, this is empirically true, they'll give them some bullshit job. You're on our board of directors. Board of directors officially meets once or twice a year, and you just kind of talk about things and you make a vote. What they're really hiring them to do is something called government relations, which is you hire the former regulator to go lobby on your behalf to the new regulators. Because the old regulator, they've been doing the business for 20, 30 years. They know everyone involved. They know the process involved. They know who's more likely to be persuaded by what. So you hire the ex-regulator to work for you. You not only get information about how the government works, you can also use them to push specific regulations that are in your favor through. Yes?
Is there ever like a moral obstacle to doing that? Like if you believed in like the cause you were regulating, would you like have to like accept like a really high pay before you would go against it?
Sure. Sure. But you ever read spy novels or watch spy movies? You know, spies, they have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves, right? A lot of those spies didn't invent those tricks, or those tricks don't stay secret. There's something called a honeypot in spies. Who knows what a honeypot in the spy world is? A honeypot is a sexual object whose job is to seduce someone you want to get information from. It's typically women trying to seduce men, but not always. Anyone can be a honeypot, anyone can be a target for honeypot. Businesses also use honeypots to get regulators, either formal or current. Regulatory capture. Gotta watch out for that. Last one. The last one is just run-of-the-mill incompetence. Just incompetence. Government regulators, they can be stupid. They're normal people. Not all of them have degrees in economics. Some of them could have really, really good intentions. For example, say there's been a tragedy, a hurricane or an earthquake or a virus that's caused the city to shut down. There's a shortage of supplies of that city. There's a shortage of toilet paper in that city. We talked about this before. If there's a shortage, it's going to be incentives for entrepreneurs to come in with new products at a higher price. Right now, Amazon is selling hand sanitizer for up to $200, I've seen. Right? A really, really good-hearted politician can come in and say, no more price gouging. We're going to make it a law that your prices have to be set lower. We're going to set a price ceiling. When you set a price ceiling that's below what the equilibrium would have been, you're going to get an even worse shortage than before. You're going to make people worse off than before. When you have a shortage of face masks, and people are bringing in new face masks at a higher price, right now the strategy is for people to just chastise the people who are hoarding face masks. But if you just jacked up the price, people wouldn't be stacking 2 or 3 face masks on top of each other. The price would be higher, but medical professionals who need the face mask would be willing to pay the higher price. And someone who's just self-quarantining at their own home, out of fear, they might not buy 200 face masks for themselves, just in case. There's an old joke. 3 people were in prison. First guy, everyone asks, like, what are you in for? First guy says, I was charging a price above everyone else. They arrested me for price gouging. What are you guys in for? Second guy says, I was charging a price below everyone else. They charged me with predatory pricing. What are you in for? To the third guy. Third guy says, I was charging the same price as everyone else. They arrested me for collusion. Price gouging, predatory pricing, and collusion are all part of monopoly. People do pay either enormous fines or even go to prison for breaking those laws. But competition, as we learned, is a dynamic process. It's not perfect. Just one last thing to remember. Be aware of the nirvana fallacy. Be aware of the nirvana fallacy. Do not compare the real world to some perfect, unattainable nirvana. With that, I'll see you guys on Friday.